current slowdown. We are honored to have you, sir, here. Now, I request the Honorable Chair to deal with the proceedings.
Good morning to one and all. As mentioned earlier, today we have with us an eminent personality, Professor Surajit Mazumdar from CSP Jawaharlal Nehru University. We have heard different dimensions of fiscal crisis and the fiscal slowdown during the last 2 days. And today we are moving to a new dimension, that is the fiscal consolidation aspects. Thank you, sir, for being here with us for this session. Particularly, he's here with the last 1 day sleepless night he had reached here in between different hectic schedules at JNU. On behalf of the Department of Economics and on behalf of the participants present here, I cordially welcome you, sir, to this. I think you can take one hour because the other speaker, Emmanuel Thomas, can't attend our program due to other reasons.
If I speak for 1 hour, what will I say tomorrow?
No, 45 minutes and after discussion. Each one.
For this invitation to participate in this seminar. As Professor Anitha mentioned, I have had a very sleepless night, and therefore if my coherence is adversely affected as a result of that, please excuse it. My task has been made even more difficult because my PhD student, Emmanuel, decided to not arrive, and therefore there is no one to whom I can pass on the baton in this particular session. So I have to carry it as far as possible on my own. So this topic that I have chosen to make a presentation on today, what I'd like to draw attention through this is the fact that while we are talking about a slowdown in the GDP growth of the Indian economy, which is of relatively apparently recent origin, there is a history to this, and there's a history which has some relationship with the kind of approach to fiscal policy that has come to be enshrined in India after 1991. This approach is what we call the principle of so-called sound finance, in which the emphasis is on ensuring that those taxes are low and the fiscal deficit, the gap between the government's expenditures and the revenues, is maintained within certain limits. Theoretically, the rationale for such an approach in circumstances where an economy is not in a full employment condition has never been really established, but the world over, in the last 30 years or so, this kind of principle has got enshrined, that the approach has to be that fiscal policy approach has to be, stance has to be such, if the market economy is to work, that the government maintain a check on its expenditures and maintain a check on the deficit between, and the accumulation of public debt itself must be kept within certain limits. So this philosophy has also come to India as part of the process of globalization, and into what we call the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, the FRBM Act, was, in a sense, giving this particular philosophy a legal kind of basis and sanction, which set targets for fiscal deficits that the government must achieve, both central as well as state governments. In the National FRBM Act was passed in 2004 by the Parliament when the NDA government was in power. It was notified, however, by the next government the finance minister who was responsible for piloting the FRBM Act through the Parliament and the finance minister who then notified it, both are in trouble for different reasons. Yashwant Sinha was the finance minister of the NDA government and Chidambaram was the finance minister who notified the FRBM Act. But that FRBM Act was paradoxically adopted in a background where for some period of time it appeared that the government in India, the central government in particular, was willing to expand its public expenditure. So if you recall that after 2004, there were a set of measures including the adoption of the MNREGA, where it appeared that there was a shift from the exclusive emphasis earlier on cutting public expenditure to expanding expenditure on certain kind of social welfare schemes. Subsequently, in 2008, you had the global crisis. The global crisis, the world over, led to the adoption of fiscal stimuli. Government after government adopted fiscal stimulus policies in order to avoid the worst effects of that particular recession. So did the government in India. And then, the world over, as the fiscal stimuli led to an increase in public debt, there was a renewed emphasis on returning to austerity or fiscal consolidation. In India, the term used was fiscal consolidation and not austerity. And from the beginning of this decade, we made that shift towards this approach of fiscal consolidation, that as a result of the fiscal stimulus, the deficit had gone up, and the idea was that they had to be brought back down to levels that had been there before the stimulus. As it happens, till date, that has not happened. But the whole decade has been spent in emphasizing or attempting to bring down the fiscal deficit. And what I want to do is to relate this slowdown to this particular kind of fiscal stance. How is, by drawing attention to certain correlations between what is happening in the fiscal front and what is the other variables in the economy, how they are moving. So if one looks at the deficit itself, the combined deficit of central and state governments as a percentage of GDP, you can see that the first decade of liberalization went this way and that way as far as the attempts to bring down the fiscal deficit were concerned. So the immediate aftermath of the 91 crisis was that the deficit was brought down somewhat, but then it again increased towards the second half of the 90s. But there was a very sharp decline in the fiscal deficit that happened in the 5 to 6 year period that preceded the global crisis. If you see that it comes down from 9.64 to 3.99%, which is the lowest that you had in a long period. Okay, so that's the period in which this particular thing comes down. Now, what is this period? This is the period in which India's growth, GDP growth, suddenly picks up and attains levels that are never been seen in the past. The 8 to 9% per annum GDP growth rate. For a 5 year period, you had this boom, which ended with the global crisis. With the global crisis, there was the fiscal stimulus, which was a combination of tax cuts and some stepping up of expenditure. But in India, the emphasis was more on tax concessions or tax cuts rather than on stepping up of expenditure. So that led to the deficit again climbing back to the 9% plus level. And that's when, at the beginning of this decade, from 2011-12, the shift is made towards fiscal consolidation to bring down that particular deficit. And you can see that there has been a trend of some decline in that, so it's not gone back as yet to the level in 2007-8. Now if you see this particular movement of the deficit alongside the trends in expenditure, what you find is that compared to the movements in the fiscal deficit, the movements in expenditure as a percentage of GDP is not something that changes that much. Okay? It's not something that changes that much. In which case, really where are you? And so if you look at the expenditure levels today and compare them what they were at the beginning of the century as a percentage of GDP, it is roughly the same. I'm ending these at 2017-18 because the only figures we have for 2018-19 are revised estimates. And now our experience is that there is a lot of difference between revised estimates and actuals. So sometimes it will give you a false impression that suddenly something has changed this year if you use the revised estimates figures. So therefore I'm ending in 2017-18 because that's the actual figures. So you find that in this period of fiscal, when the deficit came down, okay, that's a period where actually the expenditure to GDP ratio also slightly showed a downward trend. Meaning that the period in which, according to popular perception, there was some stepping up of public expenditure growth, it's not that that expenditure as a percentage of GDP was being increased. In fact, it was coming down. Okay, it was coming down slightly. Okay. What allowed, however, public expenditure growth to be rapid was the fact that GDP growth itself was rapid. Not that the ratio was going up, but the GDP growth was rapid. So expenditure could grow because GDP was growing fast. Okay. And the causality actually ran from growth to expenditure rather than the other way around. In this period of fiscal consolidation, on the other hand, you see a steady process of that expenditure GDP ratio again being brought down after having gone up slightly during the period of the fiscal stimulus. After that, there's a steady process of bringing it down. It will become clearer when we look at specifically the central government figures, because that gives you a clearer picture of what's actually been happening. So the other side of the budget is, of course, of the fiscal is, of course, the revenue side. And the main source of revenues are taxes. So the movements in the fiscal deficit that you see have a lot more to do with what is happening to tax revenues than what is happening to the expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So if you see that period of high growth between 2003-4 and 2007-8, that is the only period, that's the only period since 1991. That's the only period since 1991 in which the tax to GDP ratio in India went up. That's the only period in which the tax to GDP ratio went up. So it's the combination of that tax to GDP ratio going up and the slight decline in the expenditure to GDP ratio, which brought that fiscal deficit down to under 4% by 2007-8. When the stimulus happens, the tax to GDP ratio again falls because tax concessions are part of that stimulus package. And then you take a long time to go back to those levels, and even these levels reached in 2017-18. There's a story behind that which I'll slightly come to. Otherwise, the actual reality is that the tax to GDP ratio in India has never recovered from the effects of the fiscal stimulus. Despite many of the measures of fiscal stimulus, tax concession having been rolled back. Okay. It's never really recovered. The other thing that you see is that in the period of that boom, when the tax to GDP ratio goes up, it's direct taxes which are responsible for that increase in tax to GDP Within the direct taxes, there are two main direct taxes. Within the direct taxes, the most important source of that increase in tax to GDP ratio was corporate taxes. So why did the tax to GDP ratio go up? The tax to GDP ratio goes up because the corporate sector's profit, which is what corporate taxes are imposed on, they grow faster than the high growth of the rest of the economy. Not because rates went up. No corporate tax rates were increased at that time. It is just not the effective tax rates increased because of any changes in the concessions that are given. The source of the increase was the fact that the corporate sector's growth and the growth of its profits were both faster than the high growth of the overall GDP. And that is what was responsible for the increase in the tax to GDP ratio. The rest of the increase comes from personal income taxes. Okay. So about 25% comes from personal income taxes, 3/4 comes from corporate taxes. So in a sense, your tax to GDP ratio in that period increases because you have a growth process which is highly skewed in favor of the corporate sector and relatively higher income groups. That's the source of the increase in the tax to GDP ratio. So in contrast to the view that that was a period in which the fiscal policy became more friendly towards the majority of the population which was getting left behind in the growth process, this would suggest that what was actually happening was that the growth process, in a sense, became even more unequal in the period of high growth. And that allowed some period of increase in public expenditure because the effect that had on the tax revenues of the government. So you had a period in which it was possible to have this sweet combination of reducing the fiscal deficit and sticking to your commitments to the FRBM Act, as well as to increase some bit the public expenditure on specifically social sector. Okay. That ended with the global crisis. That possibility of that sweet combination ended with the global crisis. And after that, if you see, there is the direct tax to GDP ratio, that is no longer source of any increase in tax to GDP. And in fact, a lot of the recovery in the process of fiscal consolidation is based on indirect taxes. Now, if you look at specifically central government, this tells you a little bit more of the story of this decade, since fiscal consolidation began. So the bottom line is what has been happening to the central government's fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, steadily coming down. Okay. The top tells you what has been the main source of that, which is a relatively compressionary approach towards expenditure. Expenditure compression rather than expansion has been central part of the process of fiscal consolidation. Okay. What I have done here is, because in this decade you had this change in the proportion of central revenues, central tax revenues which go to the states. Okay. You also had the introduction of GST. GST meant that the adoption of a policy to compensate states for revenue loss. So when GST is introduced, along with that there is a GST compensation cess, which artificially increases revenue and expenditure of the government, because it collects a cess and then it transfers them to the states as compensation. So what should have otherwise appeared in the state accounts appears in the central accounts and artificially inflates both sides of the budget. So compensated for that by removing the compensation paid, not the cess received. The cess received has usually been an excess, so I am treating that as additional central government revenue. Now, if you So if you take the central expenditure plus the amount that is transferred to the states, which is the state share in central taxes, plus the GST compensation paid, that you can take as the total public expenditure that is being facilitated by the central collection of taxes and expenditure. And that is, you can see, been steadily declining, but for a short period after 2014-15. Okay. Now compare that with the two lines in the middle. The bottom one of them is the gross tax revenue from central taxes, excluding GST compensation paid and excluding the taxes on petroleum, oil and lubricants. If you exclude them, what you have is that the tax to GDP ratio basically has not increased at all over this entire decade. So fiscal consolidation has not involved actually any reversal, effective reversal of the tax concessions that were part of the stimulus. The entire burden has been on the expenditure side. 2014 onwards, you had a decline in international oil prices. The central government in India took advantage of that by increasing the excise duties on oil. Okay. As a result of that, for a period of time, it was able to get some additional revenues. That's the period in which it was also possible to slightly increase expenditure while keeping the process of reducing the fiscal deficit on track. But of course, international oil prices didn't go on falling. And then you had the effects of demonetization and GST on the revenues. So even that has started dipping downwards. And if you see the more recent picture of the last 2 years, this year and the previous year, you can see how acute has become the revenue crisis of the government. Okay, so once you don't have the option of using additional duties on oil, the picture that is emerging now aggravated by the slowdown. So here again you see that the growth and the revenues, the causality is running from growth to revenues, not from expenditure to growth. So you see here that in the previous year, 2018-19, and you can say, you can see I'm putting here the figure of the actuals. If you look at the budget document, you will only find revised estimates. Even the budget presented in July, the final budget, which was presented in July, had the revised estimates which were there in January. Okay. And in those revised estimates, a lot of the fall in revenue was not actually accounted for. So though these figures were available, the Controller General of Accounts every month publishes, and the final accounts for the year are put out by May end. So when the budget was presented, it was known that this is the picture. But the same old revised estimates were incorporated in the budget. So you see that in the last year itself, the growth of revenues was very poor compared to what was budgeted, and of course even poor compared to what is the nominal GDP growth. And this year, it is looking even bleaker. So we have figures up to September for what is the actual revenue collection. So for half the year, we have already figures 1.5% growth. So if you take into account the fact that by official figures, the inflation rate is around 3.5% to 4% range. In real terms, we are having a decline in revenues. A contraction of revenues rather than a growth of revenues. Okay? So now the question is going to come that if you are going to stick to the idea of fiscal consolidation, stick to the objective of reducing the fiscal deficit because you still haven't reached the target, then what are you going to do in the face of this revenue situation? Are you going to, in the face of an economic slowdown, aggravate the demand constraints in the economy by cutting back on public expenditure. It seems that that is the approach, because there is no retraction from that approach of fiscal consolidation. But that fiscal consolidation approach has produced, has taken place in a background of economic conditions in which what you see as a slowdown now is not something that has happened now. It is only one further process of deceleration in an economy which has been steadily, whose growth process has been steadily coming down. Why am I saying that? This is what we are presently concerned with. That okay, last 5 quarters, you see a quarterly GDP growth rate on a year-on-year basis. You are seeing that it's coming down every quarter. And now everyone is waiting for the second quarter of this year, what it is going to show. Okay, so this is what is the immediate slowdown that everyone is talking about. But what is the longer term picture? Now you know that this figure comes from the new GDP series introduced in 2015 with 2011-12 as the base. That's a GDP series which has been very controversial, whether the methods adopted there are appropriate and does the GDP series actually capture properly what is happening to Indian GDP growth. The second element of the controversy was that if you were to apply this method to previous years, okay, what would be the GDP growth rates of the previous years that you would get? Now one picture you get then, if you go by what has finally been officially put out by the CSO at the best of the Niti Aayog, then the picture that you get is that the previous decade's growth was not as high as the old GDP series showed. And this decade's growth is pretty good, and therefore you don't see any change except for the period of the global crisis and except for one small slowdown at the beginning of the decade, which is when the fiscal consolidation process also is beginning. Other than that, you have a pretty steady process, but you have some dip in the post-demonetization years. So even the new GDP series is recognizing that there is some effect of, like this is a correlation, that demonetization appears to have, as a result of that correlation, some effect of slowing down of GDP growth. Okay. But till then, it could be that there is only one small dip during the global crisis and one small one at the beginning of the decade. Okay. There's otherwise a pretty steady. But this is another picture where you have the old, so in this picture, the first one, the red is the old 2004-5 base year series. The red is the 2004-5 base year series. And the blue is the back series put out by the CSO and the, which is based on the new GDP series. Okay. Same thing here. Here the blue that is being shown is the back series estimates made by the Committee on Real Sector Statistics, also by the National Statistical Commission, established by the National Statistical Commission, which Surajit R, known as the Surajit R Committee, which also use the new method to do a back series. And their back series doesn't show much of a difference between what the 2004-5 base year series was showing and what the new method would result. But Arvind Subramanian, the chief economic advisor, recently with this paper where he tried to see whether this new GDP series was overestimating Indian GDP growth, and his conclusion was that most likely the average since the beginning of this decade till 2016-17, the average GDP growth in India was 4.5% per annum. Okay. If that is correct, and we take the old 2004-5 base year or the other back series figures, then that is telling you that there is already been from the beginning of this decade before demonetization even, a slowdown in GDP growth from the 8 to 9% level to 4.5 to 5%. So, in which case, what you could possibly have seen is that GDP growth rate first in the previous decade, for whatever reasons, is in that at that 8 to 9% level. But as I said, a growth process which is highly inegalitarian in terms of where the benefits of that growth is going. So you have that in the previous decade. Then you have a slowing down at the beginning of the decade, which coincides with the transition to fiscal consolidation. Okay. And then from that you have a further slowing down post demonetization. And it's the next act that you're seeing in the form of the current slowdown. So it is not then a story of a slowdown that you are seeing now. It's a story that has unfolded over the entire decade. And over that entire decade, the fiscal stance of the government has been the emphasis on fiscal consolidation, on reducing the deficit. The only period in which that allowed some degree of stepping up of expenditure was that brief period when revenues from oil taxes allowed some a better revenue performance. Otherwise, the expenditure compression has been the main thrust of fiscal policy throughout this decade. So what has that produced? So it's plausible then to argue that the expenditure compression or affected adversely any demand conditions in the economy which may have been responsible for this slowing down of growth. Okay. So one effect of that you can see very clearly is on the industrial sector. If you use the GDP series in manufacturing growth rate, it goes all over the place. 12.5% one year, 3.5% another year. And the manufacturing GDP measure is one of the most controversial parts of the new GDP series. But if you look at the index of industrial production, and this is also same base year, 2011-12, issued after the new GDP series was issued, you see that this particular decade is reminiscent of the stagnation decade of the mid-60s. That is the worst decade of industrial growth since 1980. Worst period of industrial growth. So you can see that there is this, and this transition happens again at the beginning of the decade. The other, you can see also the effects of that on the share of manufacturing in Indian GDP. All indicators, even the new GDP series, it changes the level of manufacturing GDP, but is not able to show a trend of increase in manufacturing manufacturing share in GDP. That is following whichever indicator or measure that you use. So India is deindustrializing much before it has achieved any full-fledged industrialization. And you can see the effects of that on even the employment growth in the manufacturing sector, that the employment growth is also slowed down. And this in a situation where the manufacturing sector employment growth had almost exclusively become concentrated in the organized sector, because the unorganized manufacturing has been shrinking in the last 15 years or so. But even in the organized sector, the growth of employment in the previous decade was significantly greater than in the present decade. So the 6-year period here you see in this decade showing less growth of employment than 4-year periods were showing in the previous decade during the boom. You also see during this period clear evidence of a very significant slowdown in the growth of investment. One of the features of the previous decade was very sharp growth of, a very high growth of investment in the economy. Okay. So investment involves either construction or expenditure on machinery and equipment. Machinery and equipment is either produced domestically or is imported. On both you can see that the trend in this decade has been very different from the previous. Again, you see that correlation with the transition to fiscal consolidation, that you have this drastic slowdown in the investment growth, and the investment ratio in the economy starts falling. Okay. In the previous decade, we had a very sharp increase in India's investment ratio. In 5 years, it went up significantly by almost 8 percentage points. But in this decade, you see a process of decline. The same is also true of India's trade. India's trade as a proportion of GDP has also been showing a shrinking trend in this decade as compared to whereas in the previous decade, that is something that was increasing rapidly. You also see clear effects of the slowdown in demand growth. After all, investment and investment and trade are also sources of exports, and investment are sources of demand growth. And investment also responds to demand conditions in the economy. So if you are having a whole decade of stagnation in investment, then that is saying that the underlying demand conditions of the economy are adverse. And that is being aggravated by the slowdown of investment. You see the effects of that demand slowdown in also what has happened to bank credit. In the previous decade, bank credit grew much faster than GDP. But in this decade, there has been a significant slowing down of the expenditure growth. So it would seem that there is fairly clear evidence that throughout this decade, the Indian economy has been reflecting conditions of demand constraint, which has impacted on investment particularly. That you can see in the form of what has happened to investment. You can see the same thing if you look at the growth of construction. Again, there is a very sharp slowing down in this particular decade. So there have been these indications of severe demand constraints in the economy throughout this particular decade. And if that coincides with the process of fiscal consolidation, in which the emphasis is on expenditure compression as the way of reducing the deficit and not on tax revenue mobilization, then there is a fairly plausible basis for arguing that the fiscal stance of the government over the state over the entire decade has aggravated the demand constraints within the economy. The other effect of this fiscal stance is that if you have this kind of a fiscal stance, then it doesn't allow fiscal policy to be used. Fiscal policy to be used for redistributive purposes. Okay. It doesn't allow fiscal policy to be used by taxing those who are getting more and transferring in various forms or through different expenditures to those who are receiving less. Now we have had, since the last few decades, a process of growth which has been accompanied by sharply rising inequalities. So these are Piketty's estimates. Top 10% share has, after 1990 particularly, increased dramatically. The next 40% has declined, and so has the bottom 40%. So there has been a very sharp increase in inequality during this particular period. And if the fiscal stance is conservative in the sense way it has been, it doesn't allow that fiscal policy to be used to counter this kind of a tendency in any way. Now, these inequalities may also, this rising inequality, what is the nature of this inequality? The nature of this inequality is that those who receive a share of the income in one or the other form as return for their labor, their levels of returns have been stagnating while per capita levels increase. In this particular case, the comparison between organized sector, where unions exist, where labor laws are supposedly applicable. The blue line is what has happened to the real wage per worker in the organized factory sector over this century, 2 decades of this century. And the red line is the per capita. Now, don't pay attention to the levels because this is just an index using a particular base here. It's the slopes that you should look at. So you have a process where growth happens, but those who labor do not receive, they are not getting an increase in the returns on their labor. What you're getting is, therefore, the earners of surplus, their share is increasing. And you can see that the corporate sector, which is the sector which has grown the fastest over this period, has been a significant beneficiary of that particular process. In 1990-91, 55% of the income that was generated in the sector would go as compensation to employees. By 2007-8, look at the picture. Actually, the period of high growth is the period in which this redistribution is also the fastest. Okay, which is why you get that increase in the tax to GDP ratio as a result of increase in corporate taxes, corporate tax revenues. So when you do get growth, what is the scenario then that you're facing? You're facing a scenario in the economy where you have a large labor reserve, which is being continuously added to because you have a crisis in the agricultural sector. It is not possible for people to sustain on the basis of the incomes that their agriculture can generate. So there is a forced movement out of agriculture that is taking place, which is adding to the reserves of labor that are available for all kinds of non-agricultural activities. This is always so large that no matter what you have boom, you have some increase in employment in some sectors like construction, it doesn't put any pressure on the wages. You always have a large labor reserve putting a pressure on the wages, so wages are tending to remain compressed. In which case, if there is any growth, the benefits of that growth will always go to the surplus earners. But then, the surplus earners must be able to also sustain the demand expansion, which will allow that growth to continue. And part of that is increase in consumption expenditure, but a significant part of that is also increase in expenditure on assets. So we've seen that. So in the high growth phase, we saw real estate boom. That's one kind of, we have seen phases of periods in which there's heavy expenditure on acquiring gold. Okay, so these are forms in which the demand for assets are satisfied. Okay. Now, as long as there is a construction boom taking place, there is a real estate boom taking place, that particular process has effects on particularly the industrial sector. It creates a demand for industrial products. Industry can also grow on that particular basis. Unfortunately, the growth of such an expenditure on assets runs into limits, because while 10% can go on buying properties as assets, you reach a point at which everyone has acquired the assets, but there's no one left to buy, because the remaining 90% don't have the means to. So it's not possible for that particular process of asset acquisition to be sustained. On the other side, you can have productive investments as one form of satisfying that demand for assets. But what are the sectors or activities in which that can happen? The two most important areas which can absorb large quantums of capital are manufacturing and infrastructure. Infrastructure, as we all know, is not a very suitable, many of the infrastructure areas are not very suitable areas for private expenditure. So unless the state spends, which is not, you're not going to be able to get that kind of expenditure on a sustainable basis. Attempts to induce private expenditure in that particular sector, we have seen the consequences of that. The NPA problem of banks is largely an outcome of trying to encourage that kind of private expenditure in infrastructure. As far as the manufacturing sector is concerned, which is another source of possible investment, the problem is in the absence of a broad-based demand for manufactured products, it's not possible to sustain that high levels of investment growth, primarily because in manufacturing, when you invest, yes, when you invest, you will create a demand for capital goods. But when you invest, you also create a capacity. You increase the capacity to produce. How do you sustain that particular capacity expansion? So the problem of too narrow a demand for base for manufactured products doesn't allow that investment growth process to also sustain. And when investment slows down, it aggravates the demand constraint. So my argument is that the high growth of the previous decade, given what it was based on, based on this particular process of highly inegalitarian growth and demand expenditure being sustained by the expansion of expenditure by both corporate sector and other high-income segments of the economy. Where did it leave the rest of the people in this country? The majority of these people. So these are relatively recent figures which gives you an idea of what are the earnings of most people in India, taken from different sources, and they all are consistent with each other in terms of the kind of figures that they give. So extremely low levels of income which don't allow them, and not income which are not also increasing, or certainly not increasing rapidly, which don't allow them to create an expanding market for, which will allow even the expenditure on assets to be sustained. And therefore, from the beginning of this decade, you can see the effects of that in the form of the slowing down of the dramatic slowing down of the investment growth. The problem is that the fiscal consolidation process, this is also kind of indicating to you how narrow is the demand base for manufactured consumption goods. So what happens is that you have from the beginning of this decade, this effect showing up in the process of slowing down. The fiscal stance of the government, where it moves towards fiscal consolidation and primacy is attached to reducing the fiscal deficit and mainly through fiscal expenditure compression. That fiscal stance neither allows you to deal with the short-term problem of demand, nor does it allow you to address the fundamental problem that a highly unequal growth process is generating. And therefore you have accumulation of this process over the entire decade, which is now becoming grimmer and grimmer, and that is what you see in the form of the recent slowdown. It is not something that has emerged today. It is something that has been developing over a period of time, and the fiscal stance of the government is something that has contributed to the aggravation of this condition rather than redressing it. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation. During the presentation, Professor Mazumdar spoke about the trajectories to the current fiscal slowdown with the support of FRBA marks and the fiscal consolidation. He emphasized that the actual benefit of fiscal consolidation goes to the corporate sector, and it affects all sectors of the economy, and which led to the global crisis. I think thus we have one more session related to the reason, which explains the reason for the high inequality in the Indian economy. Now the session is open for discussion. You can make your questions, comments, and suggestions.
Sir, as you said, the surplus salients are not spending as expected. Recently, the finance minister said it is because of the poor consumption of the millennials and post-millennials, especially in the case of automobile sector, where she said that they are not buying new cars. So that led to a slump in the automobile sector. What are the other factors which led to such a slump? Because there is the investment shrinkage, the other shrinkage also go hand in hand. As you said, the manufacturing shrinkage, the agriculture shrinkage, and all other all truncation, all compressions are going hand in hand. So what is the way out? And you mentioned that it is only a carryover, it has only a carryover effect for the previous decades. And my question is regarding the VUCA paradigm prevailing now. This is an age where volatile, uncertainty, chaotic and ambiguous situation. There is a VUCA paradigm. Is it because of that there is a roller coaster effect in economics, ups and downs frequently? Is it because of the VUCA paradigm, highly volatile, fluctuating, and ambiguous, chaotic?
But that the slowdown is actually from the start of this decade. So obviously it should have, the initial trend should be before the decade also. It should be started from the initial, before this decade, no? So, what about the stand? What is your stand regarding the current packages from the government of India, like real estate? Actually, very recently, government of India announced a package for real estate improvement, and there are certain other packages also. So, if fiscal, because actually the problem is with regard to the fiscal problem. So, is this packages is actually a good measure for the economy to revamp? And what about the political game, blame game actually going on? So can we actually blame only the incumbent government, or the blame is actually overall to all the political parties? So I would like to know your stand on this. Noel Sebastian.
Myself, Reshma Rajivan, I'm a research scholar at this department. So my question is regarding, say, one of the figure, gross tax revenue was being portrayed, and gross tax revenue excluding GST compensation and the petroleum oil lubricant tax. So I just, this is just a clarification, so I just wish to know the logic behind excluding the tax on petroleum oil and lubrication. So second one is that, so from the presentation I understood main core points was that this crisis is not something new. It's since decades this crisis has been started, and that too from the fiscal consolidation. The measure the government was adopting is to reducing the expenditure, which has drawbacks in affecting the consumption, thereby aggravating the demand constraint. So now to reverse this, what is the measure? That is whether either to increase revenue mobilization. So even if you are going to increase revenue mobilization, how long it may take to, I just wish to know your opinion, how long it may take to reverse this trend, to address this current slowdown. Thank you.
My name is Subramanian. I'm an MPhil research scholar, the Department of Politics. Your presentation is regarding the fiscal consolidation and the slowdown. I just want to know, what do you think about this slowdown in relation to the global slowdown? To what extent the global trade wars, the global economic slowdown play a role in our slowdown, the slowdown of Indian economy?
I'm a student. So you were talking about like there is no equality in growth. So while Dr. Govindarav sir was talking, he was telling that decreasing the income of rich won't be helping in increasing the income of poor. So as you were talking about the inequality that has been prevailing in our economy, what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
My name is Vijay, a student. Sir, FRBM Act, we trying to make fiscal deficit to 3.5, revenue deficit reduced to 0.5% in annum. So as a developing, India is a developing country. During the time of FRBM Act, there is a criticism that, as if we know that the most of the state of the country have not sufficient revenue capacities. So there is a, when this something figures, we limit out the something figures, the state of the country trying to cut down the expenditure. So during the last so many years, we can find out that our currency rate is declining, inflation is increasing. So that finally, the governments are trying to make the decrease in the expenditure. So it is finally affecting the poor people. So my question is, this 3.5 or 0.5, this figure is good to Indian condition.
An indication of an impending crisis. What are the possibilities of having an economic crisis? the financial sector, the banking sector is quite undermined now because NPAs are going up and Reserve Bank's autonomy is also compromised. So what are the indications of a crisis and what could be the indications of the possibility of a crisis? And what could be the ways and means to avert economic crisis? And secondly, so the financial sector has to come into focus. And secondly, the agriculture sector is still contributing 60% of the employment in the economy. So, is there any way in which the agriculture can continue to be livelihood sustaining, sector, or is there any other alternative? Because what the proponents of liberalization are saying is that now we have to go for labor and the land market liberalization. That is what they are proposing now. So, what will, as it is, our Human Development Index is only 130 out of 189. So, if that kind of a thing is happening in the agriculture sector, then what would be the implication for a country with having so many poor people? I mean, the largest number of poor people in the world. So, please respond to.
From Mahatma Gandhi College. So, automobile industry in India has witnessed around 5 lakh unemployment. So, the related agricultural industry, that means in Kerala we can say it as rubber. The rubber prices are going down. And is there any fiscal measures to address the agro pricing that will lead to the revival of the automobile industry?
Begin with something which was part of the first question and also the question that Gilbert asked. Firstly, I think this kind of an explanation of the slowdown in terms of millennials and their habits and all of that, the fact that one can even seriously consider them in itself is itself, as far as I know, the millennials are much more prone to borrowing and spending than an earlier generation was. And in any case, it's not only that automobiles are not getting sold. 5 rupee biscuit packs are not getting sold. It's a very widespread thing, and to explain in terms of these things like the habits of millennials is, I think, making a joke out of what is actually an extremely serious situation. Now, the way I look at it is this, that there was always a crisis. There was always a crisis, even in periods of boom. You have a widespread, large-scale livelihood and employment crisis. You have had an agrarian crisis persisting for a long period of time. And that this 60% figure is no longer true. It is now 44%. And there is a very large outflow out of agriculture that is happening. In fact, now the number of even cultivators, those who organize cultivation themselves, that is in absolute terms declining. But this is not happening because of better opportunities elsewhere, but because simply people are not able to sustain on the basis like that. So those are crises that have already existed. What we are actually seeing is the crisis of profits also getting aggravated as a result of this. Okay. So it is now a more widespread crisis. Naturally, 90% of the Indian population never bought cars. They never bought cars, okay. But who are the car buyers who are not being able to now buy cars? They also had to make their incomes with which they bought cars out of some activities. It is now those activities which are also facing a problem because there isn't enough demand to sustain a whole range of activities anymore. Okay. And that brings me to the question of this thing that taking from the rich will not is not the way to deal with the fact that so many people have so little. Which is that if the rich want to get the benefit of cheap labor and increase their incomes on that basis, then they must also find ways of spending that increased income in ways which can sustain that growth process. What they have proved is that they are not able to do that. They are not able to do that, and therefore the crisis is becoming aggravated. They are not being able to create the demand themselves, which they require. If they want to have the cake, they have to spend it too. They are not being able to find a way to do that. Okay? And then you say, I don't want to share it with anyone else also. Then what are you doing? I have a problem. I can't solve your problem. I'll make your problem worse, but as the way in which I want to solve my problem. That's not an acceptable approach to the question. So, if this is the problem, then certainly measures are required. In itself, inequality levels in India are extremely high and they've increased tremendously. In itself, that's not for a society a very desirable outcome. And therefore, reduction if income inequalities are to reduce, then there has to be some redistribution. How can that when there not be redistribution and then you will reduce these income inequalities? So I certainly think that measures are required for that, and this is no justification that you have tried a whole decade, which is also brings me to the question of the measures that are being taken. For a whole decade, you are trying to revive animal spirits. You spent a whole decade, and what is staring you in your face, that it has not worked. Okay, what is staring you in the face, that you have a whole decade of stagnation of investment in the economy. Private investors are not investing. Okay, it is absurd to think that they are going to start investing now simply because you reduce the corporate tax rate. So you don't want to learn from that particular experience, and therefore you insist. So that's what I said. Today the question is there. What are you going to do when the slowdown has even now aggravated a fiscal crisis to a level we are not even able to sustain last year's revenue level this year, tax revenue level. What are you going to do? What are you going to do on the expenditure side? Whatever measures have been taken, even the corporate tax reduction is going to have an adverse effect on the revenues. So is it possible at all? And I will assert this with full conviction that there is no way that this slowdown will be dealt with unless some other external conditions change dramatically. There is no way this slowdown will be dealt with. If you continue with this approach, then I am not going to spend. That public expenditure will not be stepped up. There is no way this particular problem is going to be dealt with. If you are willing to step up expenditure, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going berserk. If you have expenditure, so they said, what you're seeing is that your revenues itself are affected by what's happening in the economy. So if you have any revival of demand, if you have growth, if you have increase in employment, there will be a positive effect of that also on revenues. It's not that you just increase expenditure and the deficit goes up exactly that amount. With economic activity also expands. So in the absence of any measure of that kind, and so far the evidence is that of so many people who advise the government, whom the government listens to, they may have very different diagnosis of what is the cause of this crisis. But they are all agreed on what is not to be done, which is not to step up expenditure. And if that approach is going to dominate, I can't see how this particular thing is going to be affected. As regards the question of crisis, but I think if I understand a crisis as in a society as one in which its existing arrangements are not allowing it to reproduce itself, then I think we are already in a very deep social crisis. And the responses to the crisis are not solving but aggravating the crisis, because many of the institutional mechanisms by which you managed so far, they are also getting undermined in the way in which the responses to the crisis are. But that will take me to a different terrain of discussion. I'm not getting into that detail. But in my view, we are already in a very deep social crisis. And I am less confident than many others about where this is going to take us or lead the country to. But that's a different terrain of discussion. I'm not going to that. As regards the question of the revenue side of the thing is concerned, why is it that we think that the revenue capacity in India is limited? India has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. India also has a tax structure in which 2/3 of the taxes come from indirect taxes, which are regressive in nature, and only 1/3 come from direct taxes. Whereas the norm in most economies is that other way around, 2/3 come from direct taxes and 1/3 from indirect taxes. Now, if your economy is growing, and if some people's incomes at least are increasing, you should expect the tax to GDP ratio to increase, even if there is no change in rates. Some people whose incomes were lower will enter into taxable income brackets. Those who are in the taxable income bracket will move towards higher slabs. Okay. So you should be getting an increase in that. Why are you not getting an increase in the tax to GDP ratio? Okay. And given levels of inequality that exist in India today, certainly there is tremendous scope for increase in the tax to GDP ratio, but that requires effort at the level of for mobilizing direct taxes, whereas the entire effort is on the in the indirect tax front. That's where you're trying GST and all to get more revenues. The GST, when I was taking the gross tax revenue, as I was explaining, is that the gross tax revenue of the central government, okay, includes the GST compensation cess, which is a cess levied to compensate states for any revenue loss. Okay. Now, when you do that and you put it in the budget, on the revenue side, you add the compensation cess. On the expenditure side, you add the transfer to the states, the compensation actually paid. So that is inflating both sides of the central government's budget artificially, because this is revenue that should have been accruing to the states. Because they are not getting it after the introduction of GST, you have a mechanism of compensating them for that by the center collecting something and paying. Okay. So therefore it is artificially increasing the level of central revenues as well as taxes. So I am adjusting for that by removing the GST compensation paid. The excess of cess over compensation paid, I am treating as central government revenue. And that's why I am doing it. With regard to the question of POL taxes, the only reason for separating, I showed them with both. This was to show that the fact that the only source of that increase in the tax to GDP ratio temporarily were the additional POL taxes levied when taking advantage of the international oil prices. And that's a temporary phase that was there. It's not reflecting a fundamental trend of increase in the tax to GDP ratio. To bring that out, I was just separating that. So if you actually see the POL taxes as a percentage of GDP, they go up, the rest doesn't actually increase in that particular period. Okay, then there's this question about the link with the global slowdown. I put this way that I think the growth of the previous decade. If you look at there have been cycles, okay, but cycles also have to have a reason. Cycles are not explanations for cycles. They have to have a reason why it goes up and down. Now, if you look at investment particularly, and you look at industry, you find that since 1991 you have a period in the early 90s in which both investment and manufacturing grow somewhat rapidly. They slow down in the second half of the decade. It almost coincides, the beginning of that slowdown almost coincides with the East Asian crisis. Okay. Then from 2003-4 you have, in fact, the investment collapse, corporate investment collapse in the second half of the 90s is quite dramatic, because it goes negative growth. From about 25% per annum growth, it collapses to a negative growth in the second. Then that gets again revived in the period from 2003-4 onwards. I think most of the, at least the stimulus for that, or what triggers that, is the spillover effects of the global boom. India's high growth phase of where you get this 8 to 9% growth is not unique to India. It is something that you see in the global economy, that the global economy starts growing rapidly, and this growth is concentrated in the developing countries, and the growth between the emerging and developing economies growth rates and that of the advanced economies increases during that period up till the global crisis. But where India is different from other developing countries is what you see in what happens in India in the case of our current account, particularly because of what happens in trade. So the period before the global crisis is characterized by a certain paradox, that the net capital flows are taking place from India to from the developing countries to the developed. That's called the capital flows paradox, that supposedly capital scarce countries are exporting capital to capital rich countries, and faster growing economies are exporting capital to slower growing economies. So two elements of that paradox. Essentially, basically because a lot of that growth was based on exports, export surpluses. China, of course, leads the pack, but many developing countries had improvements in their current accounts during that period. India went the other way. So India had already a weakness that while it benefited from the global boom in many ways, the spillover effects of that, it had a weakness that in its interaction with the rest of the world, it faced this problem that it didn't have sufficient competitive ability across sufficient number of sectors to be able to take full advantage of that particular process. So a lot of the effect of that worked through the effects on the domestic economy. Though exports also grew, imports grew faster. So the net effect demand-wise of that trade was not positive, but the export growth, and particularly export growth in certain sectors which were not traditionally the dominant sectors of exports, helped in triggering and inducing the investment boom also that took place. And capital flows from the rest of the world also fueled a lot of speculative activity in the Indian economy, in stock market, real estate, all of that was effective. So there was, in a sense, already a problem that you were not being able to sustain investment growth, which for a period of time, because of the spillover effects of what was happening in the global economy, you had a revival of that particular investment boom. But with the global crisis, those global conditions never were going to be the same, and therefore after that, that positive effect has not existed. The only way India could have then sustained that boom had to be on its own internal basis, and the conditions in the economy as well as the fiscal stance of the government have not been conducive to that particular process. So, how long will this process take? As I said, that as long as the stance is that expenditure is not going to be stepped up. If this approach of expenditure compression is going to be maintained, I can only see the problem becoming aggravated. Some of the effects are long-term effects of demonetization, also the decade-long picture, then the effects of demonetization, introduction of GST, particularly the effects on the unorganized sector. Now they are spilling over to, so what I'm saying is that you're seeing the spilling over of crisis into newer and newer areas is becoming more and more widespread, and that's the way I see this current slowdown, and it's been only going in one direction as far as that. And I don't see the measures that are being taken as measures which will be able to revive this particular process. Instead, you're going to have this problem about what between the interests of reducing inequality and the interests of trying to address the crisis of profits. There is going to be increasing contradictions that one is going to see.
Thank you. Sincere thanks to each and one of you for the wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Dignitary on and off the dais, all the invited guests, faculty members and dear friends, a very good morning to all. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to deliver vote of thanks. First and foremost, it's my privilege to thank the chair of the session, Professor and Head of the Economics Department, Dr. Anitha V. Thank you, ma'am, for your valuable presence over here. Next, I would like to propose hearty vote of thanks to Surajit, Mazumdar, Professor, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you, sir, for your marvelous and admiring presentation on this topic, fiscal consolidation and the making of current slowdown, and also for clarifying the doubts of the audience regarding the topic. Finally, I would like to thank all the wonderful participants and dear friends for their active participation and cooperation. Thank you so much.
Right now we will be having a tea break. Please be right back here by 11:30.